Welcome everybody to our webinar on communities of practice. And thank you to Brenda for agreeing to do this tonight. I'm very excited about this section.
Oh, thanks.
And thank you to everybody for coming. It's great to see everybody and to have you all participate and support us in these endeavors.
Yeah, I think we'll get started. So I just wanted to acknowledge the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where we live, work, and play. And just to give a bit of info about myself, right now I'm at Eastside Family Place. You may or may not know of that. It's a family resource center on Commercial Drive by Britannia. I was at BC TEAL, and there we go, the Language Instruction Support and Training Network, where many of you met and know me from. And prior to that, it was ELSANET, again, another flash from the past. I've also been a board member, and this kind of informs a lot of how I collaborate and envision communities of practice. So alongside being an executive director, my board experience informs a lot of how I view people coming together from different walks of life. Sorry, here we go. So I recently finished my master's degree, MA, in community development. And so community development is a process where people come together to take action on what's important to them. And it empowers people, I think. I did this, this program at the University of Victoria, and I find that it creates stronger and more connected communities, which is part of, you know, the role that we played when we were working with organizations like, well, when we are working with organizations like TEAL, and prior to this, Listen, or other types of provincial support organizations that you may be involved with. They might be community support organizations or things where people come together and share, really. So community development is behind a lot of what you're doing because you're working together and informing and empowering. Communities of practice, I mean, you probably have different visions of what that looks like and what they are and how they work. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. I wanted to just throw this up. Well, it's a nice visual. I looking at the paintings, but I'm wondering if anybody has some thoughts as to why I might have pulled these together. Claude Monet and Renoir, Alfred Sisley, they met in the early 1860s. A favorite meeting place for these artists was a cafe in Paris, where they were joined by Monet and Edgar Degas, and these interactions at this cafe were essential to making them a community of practice. Even though this group painted alone, they had their own vision. It became an impressionist way of looking at the world, and these are all impressionist painters. But they actually started by sitting together in a cafe and having discussions about how they see the world. So Etienne Wenger is the person that first brought up this idea of communities of practice. So this is in 1987, a while back. And the way that he described it is the community that acts as a living curriculum. And I really like that idea, a living curriculum. And I could see how that fit in some of what we did prior with Listen and ELSANET, and even now with TEAL. There is this community that comes together and informs each other. And the three main areas that Etienne focused on was domain. So that was sharing concern or passion, a practice, of course, learning how to do it better. And then the community is the regular interaction, which is a lot of what these organizations, these provincial organizations and other groups that you're involved with, similar to a community of practice, does. So I wanted to just get a sense of how you feel when I slightly reorder the words. The practice of a community instead of community of practice. So the practice of a community, I feel, has a bit of a dynamic sense to it. You can almost see there's maybe some evolving happening here. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on this.
I think we've all learned during the pandemic that a community doesn't work unless you're active in it. You have to be dynamic in doing things.
And that also applies to your sense of being part of things, right? I mean, you can read the newsletters, but do you really feel part of it until you actually, interact? So I guess the question would be, what spurs your interest in joining a community of practice?
Anita says deep diving into shared concerns.
Oh, good.
Beth, sharing ideas.
Right.
Azam, an interest that we have in common.
Mm-hmm.
Eric says it's how I see teaching. And Harjeet says sharing experiences.
Great. Yeah, I think all of those are really relevant.
Community learning.
Mm-hmm.
From Kirsten.
Okay, so I think everybody maybe comes to the table with a slightly different focus, but in the end, a lot of those things are intertwined, and what one person comes to the table looking for is probably what another person at the table can offer. So that makes it even more dynamic. Here's some ideas that I also, sort of pull together. Peer-to-peer learning, for instance, reflection on practice, problem solving, coordination and strategy. That's what we did a lot at Listen and Elsonet. Mapping knowledge, identifying gaps. So there's a whole realm of things that you can look at. And I also have this idea about a water drop. In terms of the dynamics of a community's practice, it reverberates into practice. So you can have a drop that sort of instigates something in what you're doing, and the reverberation can impact larger systems. Or it could just impact your own practice. I mean, it really depends on the situation, but you can see how it has a ripple out effect, and then it becomes part of the sheen of the water. So it's sort of like you're integrating. It all integrates together, and it becomes part of how you operate. So I like the image of water. Actually, I'm using a water theme. I don't know if you've noticed that. A bit of a water theme today. Okay, so moving a little bit more into these three aspects. The shared domain creates common ground, inspires participation, gives meaning. And I think through community where you're building relationships and information sharing, I like this idea of the notion of a community creates the social fabric for enabling collective learning. That's a big thought, but I like the idea of social fabric and collective learning. There we go. Anyway, so this idea of social fabric for me is sort of like a patchwork. And you've got folks coming from different areas and different perspectives. And, the collective part of it is that you're all sharing and learning. Oh, of course. Now we get to have this. Apologies for that. And then a strong community fosters interaction and encourages a willingness to share ideas. And then practice Well, the community members in a community of practice could be practitioners in a domain of interest and build a shared repertoire. It's a specific focus, perhaps, around which the community develops. And the collective knowledge is really what we're looking at. How do we, how do we create collective knowledge? And I like to call this peer-to-peer professional development as well, because you're taking the time, it's experts and novices alike, taking the time to share a domain of interest, collective responsibility, creating links, and focusing on dynamic aspects of knowledge creation. So I think all of us can think of a time when this was perhaps working. For example, right now I'm involved in a couple of communities of practice myself. One of them is called a systems leadership community of practice, and it involves school teachers as well as community practitioners involved in early childhood development. And what I find is that these types of things can be both horizontal or vertical, if you know what I mean. You might look at a horizontal understanding of what you're discussing and sort of grasp a very broad range of ideas related to, look at different situations that might incorporate a certain issue. But you can also look vertically and maybe go deeper and improve your expertise, your level of understanding. So I think those interconnections become really interesting. There's also this idea of interacting regularly, creating connections and across organizational and geographic boundaries. So those of you that were familiar with when we worked before with Listen and Elsinet, there was organizational and geographic boundaries that were, sort of intersecting. And you see past those structures and you start to really feel a peer-to-peer environment. And I just wanted to note as well that communities of practice often exist only as long as they provide value. So, in at certain points, it might be time to move on and the next thing, and you're bringing information forward in another situation. But I think the idea of community of practice is that it doesn't need to be set in stone and there forever. It can evolve over time. I think that's the idea I'm trying to get here. So I wanted to do just a quick sharing. So I wanted to move a little bit more into ideas around how you can create a community of practice that moves forward. And generative is one word that came to mind. So this idea of generative ideas comes from significant conversations, shared struggles, new insights, and I like the phrase "partners in thought," which I think we're all kind of doing in a community of practice. We suddenly become partners in thought, which is a new way of looking at things. How can we generate shared meaning that leads to action? So I'm involved in a compassionate systems leadership community of practice, and part of what we do is look at systems and how can we generate new ideas of breaking out of a system that sort of feels a bit like we're trapped and go to a different level. How do you get to the generative really is the question, and sometimes that's a struggle, and some communities of practice maybe are able to make that leap fairly early on, while others it takes a while. um, it takes a while to sort of find that nugget that really leads to a generative conversation, a significant conversation that drives us to the next level. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of, it's called Theory U, but it's levels of listening. really, um, through Otto Schumer. And this is something that we're working on with one of my communities of practice, actually. It's an approach where you're looking at different levels of listening. So listening becomes the tool. And you can maybe conceptualize how to progress to a more generative conversation. So if you look at listening one, you're kind of downloading. So that's the informational part. You're, getting lots of information and people are sharing, and there we go. Maybe it moves to listening two, where you're starting to notice a bit more. It's still factual, but you can see that some people have different ways of bringing the same ideas forward or different ways of looking at things. Then you go to listening three, and this is sort of diving a little bit more internally, where you have a connection of sorts, more empathic. Maybe somebody's describing a situation, dealing with a student or something else, and you sort of have this empathic understanding because you think, oh gee, I remember when I went through that exact thing. Then the connection happens, right? And it's sort of a heart mind connection because suddenly you're really involved. Then, if you can move to listening four, you're trying to, well, I don't even know if trying is the right word. It's more evolving to a place where some shared understanding is emerging, and maybe a way of looking at the problem from a different perspective. Maybe you're figuring out a different way of understanding. Um, it it allows for new possibilities and potentially collective action. If it's a question that the group is struggling with as a unit, it might actually be an aha moment where suddenly there's a shift, right? So you go from one side of the U and you swing down and back up again where you're connecting. So it's a bit of a shift. You're shifting from um, what was once a group of individuals more towards shifting in an identity with the group and sort of understanding the connection, right? Coming up the other side, seeing through the other person's eyes, um, maybe disconfirming what you originally thought was the right, the correct, the only way to operate, and going back out and maybe coming up the other side and revising what you may have once thought was a truth. And so looking at this whole dynamic of how it scopes down, you're opening different ways of looking, you're viewing things. It's sort of like a threshold of intention where things will change. And that reminded me of the idea of an iceberg. So I was sort of thinking of the same element of the U shape, where you're starting at the top. What's happening? What are the patterns of behavior? And you're sort of doing a deep dive, and you're starting to get a better sense of maybe it's a systems thing. Maybe there's something, a little bit more integral to how we view things that's making us look at this problem a certain way. And that pulls us all the way down to mental models and how we view things, maybe assumptions, how our beliefs shape the system, and it might bring that aha moment. So this is where the leverage idea comes, and I think communities of practice allow us to dig deeper, and this is more the I was talking about vertical and horizontal, right? So you've got different ways of looking at a problem, and for me this is the vertical dive when you're going all the way down to mental models. But you might have a bit of a horizontal party as system structure and sort of take a bit of time and go horizontally and sort of unravel a little bit. Well, how are these parts related? You know, what are the influences? What are the patterns? How does this sort of get us thinking? Um, and going through things step by step, little by little, can actually allow us the time to sort of unravel a little bit. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I wanted to just mention communities of practice are not meant to set boundaries or limitations. So my thought around this is it's evolving and you don't always know where it's going to end up. And I think that's part of the allure, because you want to be there when it happens. You might have some thoughts on what it could look like, or some possibilities, but as soon as you start saying that's what it is, then you're sort of limiting it, right? And that means you don't want to confine participants to a certain approach or way of thinking, right? It's sort of opening it up and seeing where things lead, and having the guts to take a chance and follow it through. You will also want to think about not always being led by the most educated or experienced participants, because again, that whole idea of the novice amongst us informing the experienced really sheds a light on different ways of seeing and different ways of listening. And I think, COVID was probably one of those situations where uh, people who thought differently and didn't have confines in terms of how they manage their space were probably able to adapt. And so those folks, they might have a lot of experience, and they might not have a lot of experience, but you can learn from them. So you find out that you're able to take that and run with it. And the final one was primarily having a strategy-driven or results-focused purpose. So I don't think a strategy-driven purpose is necessarily the definition of a community of practice. There might be certain areas of strategy that you want to explore, but if you demand a result, you might be disappointed, and it might not be what you were expecting anyway. So I think it's important to understand that that there's different ways of evolving a community of practice without placing limitations or expectations. I did list the resources here that I went through, especially the Theory U, which I recommend people looking into a little bit more. But there's also in this one, systemsawareness.org. If you're interested in systems thinking, collective leadership, a lot of these, I mean, because I'm coming now from a community of practice, or sorry, community development focus, there's different elements of that here. But Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book, and Mette Bowl, they're working a lot in the K-12, pre-K to 12 system, but what they're looking at is how to create compassionate systems. And I think, even thinking about all of that from an ESL world is really applicable. So it might be of interest for you to go and explore that a little bit more. So I would recommend any of these resources. There's a lot of different things that you can explore and even create a community of practice around.